Who would have thought that a nerdy old school sci-fi novel could become one of the hottest media franchises? And that's exactly what has happened thanks to some expert marketing and the Dune movie being so good. There's a lot of Dune media out there besides the movie and the books, including games. And in this video, we're going to take a look at the Dune game that swallowed its publisher like a sandworm. Now, this is the story all about Frank Herbert's Dune, not the book, the game. This is a gaming industry fable that people don't talk about much, since until the past 2 years. Dune itself was a pretty niche fan base, but it is a video game legend for sure, one that ends with its publisher, Cryo Interactive, filing for bankruptcy. Y'all know these kinds of stories can be juicy, so strap in. Although the game is named almost word for word after the book, it doesn't actually adapt the Dune novel. Instead, its source material was the sci-fi miniseries adaptations of Dune and Children of Dune. If you haven't watched those miniseries yet, they weren't too far off from the Star Wars prequels. Make what you will of that. But still, Dune is Dune. What could go wrong with turning it into an action-adventure video game? Well, quite a few things, actually. The thing about adapting any intellectual property is that things can get expensive. Have you ever wondered where all the movie tie-in video games disappeared to? It used to be that any movie that was expected to succeed at the box office would have a video game that goes alongside with it. The trend was strongest in the 2000s, but movie tie-in video games were still coming out for the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, and there's a reason why those types of games aren't made anymore. And it wasn't the ET game that made the industry see the reason. The fact is that the video games are expensive to make by themselves, and then you add on the additional cost of buying the license to make the game in the first place. You're pretty likely to end up with a mediocre or terrible game. Back in those days, publishers would expect the hype for the movie would drive sales for the game, but they were proven wrong time and time again. Frank Herbert's Dune, however, came out in 2001, before the industry had learned their lesson, and the sheer expense of buying the game's license already crippled the game's budget, and Cryo Interactive were on no THQ. Another thing that caused this game to fail was just the kind of game it was. We mentioned before that there are loads of Dune games out there, but most of them have been strategy games. In fact, Dune Spice Wars is on early access right now, and it too is a real-time strategy game. The reason for this is that strategy games make sense for the overall vibe of factions waging war on Arrakis. On the other hand, turning the adventures of Paul Atreides into a video game would be challenging to say the least, because Cryo Interactive made every incorrect decision they could with their game. Their version of Dune is an action-adventure with stealth elements. You can tell that this is a dumb idea because nearly half of the book has to be summarized in a quick synopsis at the beginning of the game. It isn't until Paul and Jessica end up wandering the sands alone that you can turn any part of Dune into an action-adventure. It is also the RPG element of running around hub areas and talking to NPCs. Unfortunately, they didn't exactly get Timothée Chalamet and the gang to do the voice acting, nor did they get Denis Villeneuve and the gang to write the screenplay. Have fun with the weird and stiff conversations with your Fedaykin. Now, you might be thinking that sure, Dune's plot doesn't neatly fit into a mold of action-adventure game, but adapting the book means making the story fit the game, right? We agree with you on that, but here's the thing. This is a bad adaptation of the story that doesn't really understand anything about Dune or its universe. You spend the bulk of the game running around deserts and ships creating using 2001 technology. At first, you have a knife that you can wave around and then you pick up some kind of laser pistol. The game leads you down these corridors of enemies standing with their backs to you, and you try stealthily to take them down. It would be funny if shooting the laser pistol at enemies, but who must be all wearing shields, cause nuclear explosions. But no one at Cryo seems to have read the book, or even watched the show, really. What's clear from looking at how this game plays is that the only motivation that drove its development was the money, and the sci-fi shows the game was based on were reasonably successful. So the only goal here was to create a gameplay system that would be easy for casual gamers to grasp, since the strategy games would be beyond the average sci-fi viewer. After hearing all this, we're sure you can figure out how well any of this was executed. This is the kind of game that's really fun to watch, but good grief, how awful would it be to play? The gameplay is stiff, repetitive, and never does anything different or engaging. It's also backed up by a really terrible adaptation of the story, leaving no redeeming quality at all to this game. On top of all of that, there's a lot of technical issues with the game too. Characters would constantly clip through objects and fail to make contact with others, and the animations were really bad, and there were long loading times and clunky menus. The PS2 version though had a bizarre issue all its own. For some reason, that game ran at slower speed than the PC version. We're not talking about frame rates. Although there were frame rate drops too, the game just straight up runs at half the speed. The incompetence of how this game was made is honestly kinda hilarious. At least the people who made ET tried. So is it any wonder that this game got raked over the coals by the critics? Over at Metacritic, the game is rocking a very respectable 48 out of 100 from 10 critic reviews. And after everything you've seen, you must be excited to hear what critics had to say about the game. Legendary game publication GameSpot bestowed a score of 3.3 out of 10 upon this game. They described controlling Paul as a chore as he constantly gets caught on terrain and other objects, and the camera following him is klutzy as well. And the guards are moronic, but thanks to the glitches getting through them is more about trial and error than good sneaking. Interestingly, IGN of all companies gave this game an 8.2 out of 10. If you ever needed proof that IGN isn't brave enough to criticize game, this might be it. They for some reason praise everything we've complained about so far, and the only con they have for the game that it's too short. Like the reviewer wanted more, they expected a sequel. Overall, the critical consensus about Frank Herbert's Dune seems to be that you must not play this game. This game is the mind killer, the little death that brings total obliteration. Permit it to pass over you and through you and turn your inner eye to see its path. Where this game is gone, there will be nothing, and only your sanity will remain. Alas, IGN will not be getting a sequel to this game because it's time to bring the story full circle. Between the cost to buy the license, the cost to make this mess of a game, and a lack of funds in general, there was only one way this could end. The game didn't sell many copies at all, and the whole production ended up being the end of Cryo Interactive. Let's take a retrospective about the great gaming institution that was Cryo Interactive. It was created by some of the many people who quit Atari in the 80s, and their first game was actually a Dune game, one that was well received. Unfortunately, all they ever did was make subpar and low-effort adaptations of sci-fi novels, so it was that their story ended where it began. Interestingly, at the time of their demise, they were making yet another Dune game. All we know is that it was called Dune Generations, but we can imagine that it would have been another Cryo Interactive masterwork. Whatever was left of Cryo was absorbed by Dreamcatcher Interactive, who were known for producing the cult hit FPS Painkiller, and not much else. They were ultimately bought by a company called Joe Wood, and in 2011, Joe Wood was bought by Nordic Games. What used to be Cryo Interactive is now part of THQ Nordic, which is Nordic's way of keeping the THQ name alive. THQ, of course, was another company that was partially killed by its tie-in video games. As George Lucas would say, it's like poetry, this all rhymes. And that's it for today. What did you think about Frank Herbert's Dune? Do you like the reviewer for IGN? Do you see any redeeming quality in it? Also, let us know what your favorite Dune video game is. But whatever you do, don't run off in slow motion without liking, sharing, and subscribing.